Hello, I'm Wolf Blitzer. It's 1 p.m. here in Washington, 8 p.m. in Moscow, 1 a.m. Tuesday in Manila, in the Philippines, wherever you're watching from around the world. Thanks very much for joining us. President Trump marks his 200th day in office today, taking direct aim at the news media and touting his base. But he's also facing major challenges here in the United States and indeed abroad. The president is at his golf club in New Jersey on what the White House is calling a working vacation. He tweeted today that his base is bigger and stronger than ever, despite the news media. Meanwhile, in Manila, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov faced off over new sanctions on Russia and the state of relations between the United States and Russia. Back here in Washington, the Deputy Attorney General weighed in on the scope of the Russia investigation. Rod Rosenstein says independent counsel Robert Mueller can pursue any evidence of a crime that he uncovers. And North Korea today threatened revenge against the United States over new sanctions. The United Nations Security Council unanimously approved the sanctions in response to Pyongyang's ballistic missile tests. North Korea today calling the sanctions an attack and warning the United States, and I'm quoting the North Korean state media right now, against believing that its land is safe across the ocean. The sanctions against Pyongyang dominated a number of discussions at the Asia Regional Security Forum that's ongoing in the Philippines. Both the Russian and South Korean foreign ministers spoke with their North Korean counterpart, the North Korean foreign minister, at the meeting. For more, let's go to our senior international correspondent, Ivan Watson. He's on the scene for us, joining us live from Manila. Ivan, North Korea clearly not backing down in its public statements. So what happens next with these latest sanctions?
Well, the new sanctions, what they do is they ban the North Korean export of coal, of iron, and even of seafood. And in theory, U.S. diplomats say that that should cut up to a third of North Korea's export revenues. But U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, he conceded that it'll be now very important to see how that goes through in practice. Will this ban actually be implemented? Take a listen.
So the next steps obviously are to see that the Security Council resolution sanctions are enforced by everyone. And we hope, again, that that this ultimately will result in North Korea coming to the conclusion to choose a different pathway, and when the conditions are right, that we can sit and have a dialogue around the future of North Korea.
And when it comes to the conditions being right, another thing that Tillerson pointed out was, well, they've got to get some kind of signal from Pyongyang that it's ready to sit down. For instance, suspending the intercontinental ballistic missile launches. There were 2 of them just last month. He said that would be a positive sign, a signal that North Korea would be willing to sit down. But from all the rhetoric we've seen from numerous different statements from Pyongyang today, Wolf, it does not look like the North Koreans are in the mood to talk. Wolf?
All right, Ivan, thanks very much. Ivan Watson reporting for us from Manila. The White House says President Trump held an hour-long phone call this morning with the Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, and the new White House Chief of Staff, retired General John Kelly. They discussed the situation involving North Korea. Let's get some more perspective now. I'm joined by Balbina Wong. She's a former senior advisor to U.S. Ambassador Christopher Hill. If you remember, Ambassador Hill was the head of the U.S. delegation to the six-party talks aimed at resolving the North Korean nuclear crisis. Also joining us, our CNN military and diplomatic analyst, retired Rear Admiral John Kirby. He's a former State Department and Pentagon spokesperson. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Balbina, the North Korean regime, the foreign minister, actually, who was invited to attend this meeting with all these other Asian countries, including the United States. He actually met with the Russian and the South Korean foreign ministers, which is significant. He issued a statement saying this, the North Korean foreign minister: "We will under no circumstances put the nukes and ballistic rockets on negotiating table. Neither shall we flinch even an inch from the road to bolstering up the nuclear forces chosen by ourselves unless the hostile policy and nuclear threat of the United States against the DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, are fundamentally eliminated." Is that just rhetoric, or is there some significance here?
Well, I think it's both. On the one hand, we have to dismiss some of the most fiery parts of the rhetoric because this is constant, and North Korea likes to entertain the world, actually with some flamboyant language. On the other hand, I think North Korea is setting the stage, and it's saying exactly what it is willing or not willing to do. And I think, in a way, it maximalizes its position, and that's part of its negotiating strategy.
How significant is it, John, that the North Korean foreign minister was A, invited, and B, actually participated and had direct face-to-face meetings with the South Korean foreign minister, the Russian foreign minister, among others?
Not insignificant. I mean, ASEAN is they're not a normal member of ASEAN, so that they were there, I think, was unique. And I think, in a way, it's not all bad, right? That he had a chance to interact and to have dialogue with other members of the community.
What did you think about that?
Well, ARF, the ASEAN Regional Forum, is an annual event. So I don't think it's necessarily that significant that North Korea was there. On the other hand, North Korea could have chosen not to come. So I think that it showed up and it's willing to sort of set its position, which is much further out in the field than the rest of the international community, is significant.
What is also significant is that the United Nations Security Council over the weekend unanimously, 15-0, passed a resolution imposing new sanctions against North Korea. Russia on board, China on board. Clearly the U.S. the U.S. ambassador, Nikki Haley, was thrilled.
Yeah, well, and they apparently this was an initiative that they put forward. I think it is significant. These are comprehensive sanctions, and the administration deserves credit for ushering them through. But look, we have to wait to see. Sanctions take a long, long time. And don't forget, Wolf, that in 2016, the Obama administration also ushered in very comprehensive, very strong, then the strongest sanctions ever enacted against the North at the time. So we'll have to see where this goes. What it does show, though, is the international community further galvanizing against the threat posed by North Korea. And that Russia and China continue to be on board, at least on paper, is a healthy thing. Now we have to just, implementation is the devil of the detail there, and you heard Tillerson talk about that.
It looks like, and Albina, you know this a lot better than I do, the new South Korean government is certainly much more open than the Trump administration is to launching direct talks with North Korea, trying to ease this crisis.
Well, I think we have to remember that the Moon administration in South Korea, he is ideologically part of the Sunshine Policy. He firmly believes that engagement is the only way to change the regime. Now, President Trump, I don't think is ideological. I think he is willing to negotiate. You know, he's a businessman and transactional. So those two are not that far apart as people think, but they're coming from very different places.
He tweeted, President Trump, just completed a call with President Moon of South Korea. He's the newly elected South Korean leader. Very happy and impressed with 15-0 United Nations vote on North Korea sanctions. But there is a significant difference in strategy and tactics between the South Korean government and the U.S. government.
Yeah, I mean, as Balbina rightly says, I mean, President Moon Jae-in is of the Sunshine Policy, a little bit different view, a softer view towards the North than his predecessor. But I think, again, given the race that the North has been on here to develop these capabilities and the threats they continue to pose, in fact, there are increased threats now, I think you are starting to see, I think, a gelling, a coalescing of some international, including South Korean approach and pressure to put on the North. Don't forget also that one of the things that the administration is doing right, I think, is trying to work trilateral cooperation between Japan, South Korea, and the United States, which has historically been difficult given the history between South Korea and Japan, but that also is coming together.
The fact that Russia, but especially China, was on board in this unanimous United Nations Security Council resolution imposing new sanctions against North Korea, how significant is that?
Well, it is significant to the extent that finally I think the pressure is on China, actually, to do something more. But before we go around congratulating China as this incredible achievement, we have to remember this is the minimum of what China should have been doing. And we should also remember numerous times that China would not support sanctions, and Russia, by the way. So we already have 15 UN resolution sanctions on North Korea going back to actually 1993, but really 2006. 15, and during that time, North Korea has tested 5 nuclear weapons. So China is doing the minimum at this point of what it should be doing.
Thanks very much for coming. Appreciate it very much, John Kirby. You have no choice. You have to come
Yes,
in
I do.
because you're a CNN contributor. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and his Russian counterpart met in Manila for the first time since the U.S. slapped new sanctions on Russia. And Tillerson zeroed in on the reason for the sanctions, Russian meddling in the U.S. presidential election. Our global affairs correspondent Elise Labott is joining us right now. Elise, what else have we learned about Tillerson's meeting with the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov?
Well, Wolf, it seemed to be a very tense meeting. Not only was Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov complaining about those sanctions, Secretary Tillerson also was, seeking a little bit more clarification of that Russian move to cut 755 U.S. diplomats from the U.S. embassy in Russia. And so this whole issue of meddling, the Russian meddling in the U.S. election, continues to be the elephant in the room. Take a listen to Secretary Tillerson earlier today in Manila.
And Russian meddling in the elections was certainly a serious incident. We talked about it in the discussion we had with Minister Lavrov yesterday, and trying to help them understand just how serious this incident had been and how seriously it had damaged the relationship between the U.S., the American people, and the Russian people, that this had created serious mistrust between our two countries, and that we simply have to find some way to deal with that.
So a lot of mistrust, but also a lot of critical national security issues, among them Syria, which they talked about, Ukraine, and North Korea, which is why they're there in Manila in the first place. But Wolf, this issue of the meddling, the investigations here in Washington into possible collusion between Russia and the Trump campaign continue to dog that relationship and making moving forward very difficult for these two leaders.
Any indication that by September 1st, when all those American diplomats and embassy personnel are about to be kicked out of Russia, that the U.S. will further retaliate? Because, as you know, at the end of the Obama administration, the U.S. expelled, about 35 Russian diplomats, shut down 2 Russian compounds in Maryland and Long Island.
So this is a tit for tat. As you said, the Obama administration made those moves. Remember, President Putin had held off, and this is really a follow-on to that. Secretary Tillerson said that they're considering a response. I think the question is whether they can, let this stand and move forward. They've both said that they want to eliminate those irritants, as they say, in the relationship. They consider this one of them. I think it remains to be seen what that U.S. response is going to be and whether that's going to continue to spiral.
Yeah, the pressure on the Trump administration will be enormous. It's one thing to expel 35 American diplomats from Russia. It's another thing for the Russians then to tell 755 American diplomats and other embassy personnel, you're out. That's a big number. All right, Elise, thanks very much. Our global affairs correspondent, Elise Labott, reporting. Up next, as Tillerson meets with his Russian counterpart overseas, the investigation into possible collusion between the Trump campaign and the Kremlin expands. We have new information. And Mike Pence, the vice president, is striking back at a report in the New York Times that he is eyeing the Oval Office in 2020. The Times saying the vice president isn't alone. Details on what's being described as shadow campaigns that several Republicans are now running. The investigation into Russia's meddling in the U.S. presidential election appears to be entering a new phase. The source tells CNN the special counsel Robert Mueller has issued grand jury subpoenas for documents and testimony related to Donald Trump Jr.'s meeting with a Russian lawyer last summer. The Deputy Attorney General was asked how far Mueller's investigation can go.
If he finds evidence of a crime that's within the scope of what Director Mueller and I have agreed is the appropriate scope of his investigation, then he can. If it's something outside that scope, he needs to come to the Acting Attorney General, at this time me, for permission to expand his investigation.
Let's bring in our CNN crime and justice reporter, Shimon Prokopez. Shimon, update us on what we know right now about the various threads of Robert Mueller's investigation.
Well, that's right, Wolf. There are several various threads, right? We have the potential obstruction of justice, a thread, and then we have the overall big investigation, which now appears to be financial in nature, in that Mueller and his team of 16 lawyers and close to 36 staffers and investigators have been poring over all these various financial records related to the Trump organization. We're also told some of the records that are being scrutinized have to deal with his son, Don Jr., and also other property records such as Trump Tower in New York. They're looking at who has spent time there, who has rented offices there, has lived there. All of this part of their larger investigation into the relationship between Russia and folks close to Donald Trump. And really the key here now is that they want to go back, and investigators want to go back and see when were these relationships established, and if that sort of has had any effect on some of the decision making.
Yeah, and Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General, offering a very strong source of support for Robert Mueller, the special counsel, in that interview yesterday. Shimon, thanks very much. Shimon Prokopez reporting. Let's get some further perspective on the Russia investigation. Democratic Congressman Eric Swalwell of California is joining us. He's a member of both the House Intelligence and Judiciary Committees, joining us from Oakland, California. Thanks, Congressman, for joining us.
Of course, Wolf. Thanks for having me back.
So what's your reaction to the Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein's comment that the special counsel Robert Mueller can investigate basically any crime he seems to uncover in the course of his work?
Well, it makes sense, Wolf, because we know that the ties that Donald Trump, his family, his campaign have to Russia are very, very financial in nature. We know that Donald Trump has invested in the Russians over the years and that they have invested in him. He sought trademarks that he was granted over in Russia. He had the Miss Universe contest over in Russia. He sought to peddle Trump vodka over in Russia, and Russians have bought condos in his buildings in New York, and it was a Russian oligarch who purchased a West Palm Beach home that Donald Trump had bought in 2004 and later sold in 2008 to that individual, reaping a profit of 129%. It's certainly worth exploring further.
CNN has learned, Congressman, that Robert Mueller has expanded his investigation to include that actual money trail. He's following the money, as they say. So specifically, you mentioned a couple of examples. What does that suggest to you? What if he follows the money and comes up with something that has absolutely no connection to the allegation of Russian Trump campaign collusion?
Well, the premise of the collusion, or at least the premise of the ties that many have alleged occurred between Donald Trump and Russia has been that Russia sought to influence members of Donald Trump's campaign and perhaps the president himself. And one of the ways that Russia has done this with other individuals in the United States, as James Comey testified on March 20, is by entangling them in financial relationships or preying on financial distress. Now, there's also in law, Wolf, there is a concept called plain view. So if the police go to a building and they're looking for a gambling ring and they happen to walk upon a meth lab, they don't have to look the other way. They can actually explore that as long as they are lawfully in the building. So if they are lawfully looking for coordination with Russians and they come across other crimes that may have been committed, they don't have to look the other way.
But you've heard the president, he calls this whole Russia probe a witch hunt, a hoax. And he goes specifically one step further, saying that probing his finances or those of his family members and associates, that simply goes way too far, crosses that red line. Your reaction?
Well, good thing he doesn't get to set the red lines here. Wolf, Congress also has a role to play, and the Senate, in a bipartisan way last week, showed that they intend to put guardrails in place if he tries to get rid of Bob Mueller. So I'm satisfied that leaders in Congress will assert our co-equal jurisdiction to make sure that this investigation is able to fairly run its course.
If you have great confidence in Robert Mueller, and I assume you do, why do you still want an independent commission, a separate new commission to be set up to investigate Russian meddling in the U.S. election?
Bob Mueller's role is to understand whether any crimes were committed. Our role in Congress, and I believe the September 11 Commission, what they did so well was that they were able to look outside of the crimes, but at how we can make sure this never happens again. So after September 11th, a bipartisan appointed independent panel of commissioners who had foreign policy and national security expertise looked at our vulnerabilities and then made recommendations for Congress to put in place how we can make sure that a vulnerability like that never happened again. Here in Congress, I see that this has become too politicized, and also we just don't have the time to devote ourselves to understanding just exactly what Russia did. And, you know, it's certainly important, but there's other duties in Congress, and so I think the best thing we can do to depoliticize it, to debunk a lot of the myths the president has put out there, and declassify as much of the facts as possible for the public, is to have a full-time commission look at what Russia did, and then have us go to work to make sure the ballot box is more secure next time.
As you know, in recent days, there's been a bipartisan push among some senators to actually bar the president from directly firing the special counsel, Robert Mueller. The White House counselor, Kellyanne Conway, says that's not even on the president's radar. Listen to this.
Does the president commit to not firing Robert Mueller?
The president has not even discussed that. The president is not discussing firing Bob Mueller.
All right, so what's your reaction to Conway's statement?
Well, the president has a past history of trying to intimidate individuals by kind of floating out ideas. We saw this with the suggestion that President Obama had wiretapped Trump Tower. He said that James Comey better hope there aren't tapes, which I believe was a way to try and intimidate the former FBI director from coming forward and testifying. And I think by trying to undermine Bob Mueller's investigation, he is trying to make Bob Mueller worried that he may be fired, or try and do everything he can to undermine and, I guess, cast doubt upon anything that Bob Mueller finds. I think the American people are behind Bob Mueller, and they will probably accept whatever he finds or doesn't find.
So where do you see this heading in the short term? Are we close to getting some answers?
On our House investigation, we made more progress in the last 3 weeks with the witnesses we brought in than we had made in the prior 5 months. So we're steadily going forward. We're interviewing witnesses, reviewing documents. We hope to report back to the American people soon. And we just want to make sure that Bob Mueller has all the resources and all the runway necessary to also report back to the American people and clear the president if these were all just coincidences, but to hold people accountable if it was something more.
What's the definition of soon?
Well, I hope before the midterm elections, Wolf, for the House investigation, because we want to make sure when people go to the ballot box in November that we have put some reforms in place so that not only Russia is deterred from doing this again, but other countries with similar capabilities.
Those midterm elections are still a long way off. All right, Congressman Eric Swalwell, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, my pleasure, Wolf.
Coming up, Pence for 2020. The vice president says that idea is absurd. It's offensive. We have details on that new report that he, along with other prominent Republicans, are already positioning themselves for a presidential run. President Trump kicking off his 200th day in office with a series of fiery tweets lashing out at the news media, touting his base and reinforcing that he is not, repeat, not on vacation, saying, quote, working hard from New Jersey while White House goes through long-planned renovation, going to New York next week for more meetings. Let's go to our White House reporter, Caitlin Collins. She's joining us from Bridgewater, New Jersey. That's near where the president is staying at his golf course. Caitlin, the Russia investigation was also the focus of several of the president's tweets this morning. Update our viewers.
Yes, it definitely was, Wolf. Though the president says he doesn't have time to watch television or doesn't watch CNN specifically, he was clearly watching it this morning when Senator Richard Blumenthal was being interviewed on New Day. In that interview, Senator Blumenthal voiced support for continuing the investigation into Russian meddling in the election. Let's listen to what he had to say.
This grand jury investigation also involves the rule of law, and fundamentally Americans care about the rule of law. And so protecting Bob Mueller through the legislation that a group of us on a bipartisan basis offered last week, requiring a 3-judge panel if the president threatens to fire Bob Mueller, I think is very important to protect and safeguard the independence and integrity of that investigation.
Now, we know the president was watching that, Wolf, because just minutes after that interview aired, he went on a tweet storm about Senator Blumenthal. Let's look at what he had to say. Interesting to watch Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut talking about hoax Russian collusion when he was a phony Vietnam con artist. He continued, never in U.S. history has anyone lied or defrauded voters like Senator Richard Blumenthal. He told stories about his Vietnam battles and conquests, how brave he was, and it was all a lie. He cried like a baby and begged for forgiveness like a child. Now he judges collusion? So as you know there, Wolf, the president is referring to a 2010 controversy when Blumenthal made repeated remarks that he had served in Vietnam, though it was later cleared up that he had served his full Marine service here in the United States. It's a familiar attack that the president has used often to criticize Blumenthal, but it really gives us some insight into how the president spent his morning here in rainy New Jersey on Twitter and watching TV.
It's interesting, Caitlin, that Blumenthal responded to the series tweets of his own. Mr. President, your bullying hasn't worked before and it won't work now. No one is above the law. Then he tweeted this issue isn't about me. It's about the special counsel's independence and integrity. Caitlin, thanks very much. Caitlin Collins reporting for us. Let's discuss this and more. Joining us, our CNN senior political analyst Mark Preston, our CNN political director David Chalian, and White House reporter for Bloomberg News, Shannon Pettypiece. Let me get specifically, President tweeted, David, that his base is stronger than ever. Is that backed up by the polls?
No. There's not actually, I can't find a shred of evidence. He didn't just say stronger than ever. He said getting bigger and stronger, growing. I cannot find evidence in any poll, recent poll, that shows his base in the polls is actually growing and getting stronger. Now, he pointed out in his tweets, Wolf, to rallies in Pennsylvania and Iowa and Ohio and West Virginia. Clearly, he still has very robust rallies with very enthusiastic supporters. I'm not sure that they are growing bigger and stronger than they were during the campaign or before. So I really don't know what the evidence is that could back up that claim.
What did you think of this exchange he had with Senator Blumenthal going after? It's not the first time he's done it. Clearly, the president was watching CNN's New Day. Senator Blumenthal was a guest. He was angry about what he heard from Blumenthal, and then he launched into this attack.
Let me answer it two ways. Let me answer it first as a father who has 2 children, who you would think would look up to their leaders, the President of the United States. And the way that he acted this morning on Twitter is not something that I can turn to my children and say, this is a good example of somebody that if you know to follow, specifically if you have a disagreement, when clearly the President has a disagreement. From a strategic standpoint, it makes absolutely no sense other than to try to connect with some in his base who are supportive of him. If you look right now, he has more than 35 million followers on Twitter. Could you imagine if he took the energy that he has and put it into getting behind an infrastructure bill and try to mobilize 35 million people on Twitter, how much more powerful he would be? But in many ways, Wolf, I do think that his actions are actually detrimental to him making progress.
Yeah, Senator Blumenthal is going to join me later today in the Situation Room. We'll get more of his reaction to what we heard from the president. This strategy, the tweet storm, what's behind it, Shannon?
I mean, there were these tweets this morning, but it has appeared that General Kelly and Chief of Staff Kelly has been trying to rein in the tweets, and our reporting indicates that there has been an effort by Kelly, by his lawyers, to at least not get him to stop tweeting, but to have someone review the tweets and to at least let him know these are the implications if you do this. This is what you're going to be stepping in if you move in this direction. So I don't know if that was the case with these Blumenthal tweets, but you could certainly see if someone went and said, all right, well, this is going to create a distraction. If you want to do that, go ahead and do that. There's more voices in the room, though, around these tweets than there were at least a few months ago.
And to that point, you're not seeing on Twitter this morning, despite there being a tweet storm, going after Mueller or somehow exposing himself to more legal controversy in the Russia investigation. You're not seeing him go after fellow Republicans the way he did with Lisa Murkowski, which only ended in the result of her helping to defeat his hoped goal of repealing and replacing Obamacare. At least this time he is going after Democrats and going after the media, which is probably safer ground for him.
We are seeing the Vice President, Mike Pence, Mark, really going after the New York Times for that report over the weekend that Pence is at least thinking about 2020 among several other Republicans, shadow candidates, as they call it. There you see the headline from the New York Times: Republican shadow campaign for 2020 takes shape as Trump doubts grow. Listen to the Vice President's press secretary. He was on TV earlier today discussing this. Listen to this.
It's absurd, and really what you've got here is speculation, conjecture, half-truths masquerading as news on the front page of the Never Trump New York Times. The vice president has been nothing supportive. He is supportive of the president, and his singular focus is on making sure the president's agenda is enacted and that the president is reelected in 2020.
All right, so what's your analysis of this reaction?
Well, a couple things. One is we often talk about speaking to an audience of one. We see it from the White House briefing room. Oftentimes, I think that's what we saw from the vice president.
The audience being the president.
About being the president of the United States, pushing back very hard against the New York Times. But I will take like a different tact, a little bit of a different tact on this. I think it would be malpractice not to have the vice president out there making sure that his profile was strong with the donor community. If there was something that were to happen to the president, if he chose not to run, then you certainly would want your running mate to be in a strong position to then try to carry on the agenda.
And I think this might have to do more with 2024 than 2020. And I know 2024 seems like a long way out, but Mike Pence, Vice President Pence, is 57, 58 around then. So he still could have a run in 8 years. And the people I've talked to in Pence world, they see that as his political future more than 2020, but putting him in a strong position now. And that the best way to get a Mike Pence president in 2024 is to get Trump reelected in 2020 and to sort of have a nice, calm, stable, productive 4 years.
David?
And indeed, if Donald Trump were to run for re-election, and let's say he were to lose his effort at re-election, we all know that that 2024 campaign begins the day after Election Day 2020. And so that's only 3 years away from now, if indeed that were to happen. So it's not that we have never seen before the members of the president's own party with ambitions of seeking the Oval Office themselves go to certain key states, make their moves, build up their donor relations. What is interesting, though, is that it's only 6 months in, and the president happens to be in a very weakened political state right now, and so therefore the context is read a little bit differently than normal.
And we should note, very quickly, Vice President Pence has been very loyal to the president and continues to be very loyal to the
Certainly
president.
has been. All right, guys, thanks very much. Mark Preston, David Shelley, and Shannon Pettypiece. Appreciate it. Up next, the city of Chicago suing the Department of Justice over sanctuary city funding, and now the Department of Justice is firing back at the city's mayor, Rahm Emanuel. We have new information just coming in. We'll update you right after this. City of Chicago is suing the United States Justice Department over new sanctuary city funding requirements. The new conditions demand access to immigration information in order for a state to receive the federal funding. The Chicago mayor, Rahm Emanuel, says the new stipulations placed on federal grant money are unconstitutional. Let's go to our national correspondent, Ryan Young. He's joining us live from Chicago. Ryan, overall, Chicago has $3.6 billion federal dollars at stake. Tell us a little bit more about the specific grant that the city, the mayor, is now suing for.
Well, this is the Edward Bryan Memorial Justice Program. Look, a big conversation here. President Donald Trump has taken several swings at Chicago for the violence here in the city. Well, Rahm Emanuel and the city is fighting back, definitely talking about the idea that this program that they're going to put forward to pull money away from the city would definitely hurt the city. What they believe here is that being a sanctuary city allows citizens of anyone to be able to call 911. Their belief is they go through with these federal guidelines that they're putting forth, that would make certain communities not want to talk to the police department. The mayor says they need cooperation from immigrants to make sure when they dial 911, they don't have to worry about their immigration status. This back and forth has been playing out in conversations throughout the city for quite some time. Now the city is moving forward with suing the federal government, saying they need this money, the $3.2 million that comes forward, sometimes buys tasers, sometimes buys bulletproof vests. The city says to move forward, they want to make sure that they have this money. Listen to what the mayor told us early this morning.
Our police department are part of a neighborhood, part of a community that is built on the premise of trust between the residents and the police department. It's not, the police department is a part of the fabric of makes a community safe. And we want people to come forward to work with the police department, not to fear them.
And the federal government's already hitting back. Wolf, listen to this statement that they put out also this morning. Look, in 2016, more Chicagoans were murdered than in New York City and Los Angeles combined. So it's especially tragic that the mayor is less concerned with that staggering figure that he is spending time and taxpayer money protecting criminal aliens and putting Chicago's law enforcement at greater risk. One of the big conversations here is when you have someone who might need to be put on an immigration hold, do they let ICE agents know 48 hours in advance so they could have that conversation? Or do they also tell ICE agents that they have someone like this in custody? That has been the big conversation. When you talk to the police department here, they say they want to make sure that, especially in the immigrant communities, a large Hispanic community here, that they feel comfortable calling 911, especially when they're reporting crime. So you have this conversation. This is not the only city that will probably partake in this battle, but this is the first one that's taking this first punch, suing the federal government, saying that you cannot withhold these funds. They feel that it's unconstitutional. The big question now, Wolf, will other people join in this fight? Will other people join Rahm Emanuel and back him up when they're taking on Donald Trump and the federal government?
All right, Ryan Young in Chicago for us. Ryan, thank you. Up next, as the Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov meet amid a new sanctions bill. A bare-chested Vladimir Putin, he actually goes fishing. So what's behind the president's vacation photos? Much more right after this.
A penny has
North Korea slamming sanctions unanimously approved in the United Nations Security Council and vowing revenge, the regime threatening the U.S. with, quote, this statement, there is no bigger mistake than the United States believing that its land is safe across the ocean. Let's go to Fareed Zakaria, who's joining us right now. Fareed, what do you think that these latest UN Security Council sanctions, do you think they really might make a difference? Because all the other sanctions over the years certainly hasn't slowed down much North Korea's nuclear program.
Wolf, there's almost no chance that these sanctions will work. The key issue here has always been China. Remember, the UN has very intense sanctions against North Korea anyway. But North Korea is an isolated economy that does business with really one country in the world, China. China provides 50% of its food and 90% of its fuel. And so the only way that this would work is if the Chinese started to implement these sanctions in a truly sustained and almost draconian fashion, which they have never been willing to do so far. And the reason they're not willing to do it is not that the Chinese are somehow, unaware of the problems. It's that they worry about the total collapse of North Korea and what that would do. Until you solve that policy conundrum, until you have a serious strategic conversation with the Chinese about what a Korean peninsula would look like with a collapsed North Korea, millions of refugees, a unified Korea, presumably on South Korean terms, with American troops on China's border. Until you have that conversation, they're not going to suddenly start jumping just because one more round of UN sanctions has been passed.
Fareed, you have an important new CNN special report that will air later tonight, Why Trump Won. It airs at 9 p.m. Eastern. I want to play a little clip. Listen to this.
An entire industry blindsided. An industry and a country blindsided.
Stunned journalists blamed the polls.
The data was wrong.
The polls were all wrong. What does this mean for the whole polling industry?
Polling was wrong. We were wrong. Everything was wrong.
Most people still believe that the polls were way off, including Donald Trump.
Those polls were wrong on just about everything, weren't they?
But that's not right. In fact, almost all the national polls had the winner wrong, but the numbers were not far off.
The polling was like the least wrong of anything. The polling showed it was a close race, and people chose to disregard that.
The race tightened in the final days, giving Clinton collectively a 3% lead. She ended up winning the popular vote by 2%. In other words, so close that it was well within the margin of error.
So why was Donald Trump able to break through and win the presidency?
Well, on the specific issue of polling, it turned out that while the national polls were actually right, state polls were wrong in some key states. And those states had a lot of non-college educated whites who were underestimated, and it had a lot of undecided voters who broke in a historically very unusual pattern. Usually they break 50-50. They broke heavily for Trump. So those were the two ambiguities, the non-college educated whites and the undecideds, and they pushed Trump over the edge.
Well, quick question about Vladimir Putin, the Russian president. They released some new shirtless photos of the Russian leader on vacation. There we see him fishing. Anything behind the timing of the release of these new images? We've seen him shirtless, of course, on horseback before.
I think the thing about Putin, you have to remember, Trump is similar, which is he knows how to use images to bolster a certain kind of image of him as a strong man, as vibrant, as vigorous. And we may laugh at them, we may think they're corny. The truth of the matter is this kind of stuff works. It works not just in Russia, it works in Turkey, it works in China. And in some ways, this is part of what Trump does. Project an image that is more powerful than anything that you might hear in the fine print or the captions.
We'll look forward to watching Why Trump Won later tonight, 9 p.m. Eastern, for Reed's special report. That's it for me. The news continues right after a quick break.